Click, listen, enjoy.
Broadcasting live worldwide.
Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community. You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Purim is a time of joyous celebration on the defeat of the evil Haman by the Jews of Persia, led by Mordechai and Esther. Our guest, Professor Elliott Horowitz, believes and he theorizes that Purim was a day when Jews took vengeance on non-Jews. Interesting theory. I'm not sure how much basis in fact it really has, but an interesting thesis that he's put together. He has since passed away, so we present his interview on Talkline with Zev Brenner from about 5-6 years ago. Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Live in our studios, Professor Elliott Horowitz, a native of New York. He's Associate Professor of Jewish History at Bar-Ilan University, a co-editor of the Jewish Quarterly Review. His latest book is called Reckless Rights, Purim and the Legacy of Jewish Violence. Welcome to the program.
Hi.
It's a provocative cover on your book. It has a picture of a Hasidic man reading the Megillah, but he's using as a pointer an automatic rifle.
Right. It's actually a toy rifle, as I explain inside the book. The history of the picture is quite interesting. The photo was done by Alex Levak, who won Israel Prize in Photography in 2005. But in 1996, while I was working on this book, I came across a very curious book of his photographs. He has a photo every week in Haaretz, and what he specializes in are strange scenes which seem to be staged, but they're really from real life. So, in fact, here, this was a Purim scene where it was a toy gun that, Kalashnikov, actually, that a Hasidic young man was using as a pointer to follow the laning on Purim itself. And what the designer at Princeton did for the cover is simply did a montage and used the Megillah instead of a Chumash. But except for that, it's an actual scene. And it's a toy gun, which the Chassid is using as a pointer, not a real gun.
Now, you're uncomfortable, obviously. The book is about some of the legacy, which seems, of Jewish violence with the Purim story. So perhaps can you tell us how you came about to even exploring something which is not really discussed
I'm
much?
not really uncomfortable about anything. My job as a historian is to write about the Jewish past, and every aspect of any people's past has complicated chapters in it. And I must say my own curiosity was whetted when I saw how previous historians had tried to cover up aspects of Jewish violence on Purim. And it always happens to us, even as children, when we feel that people are hiding something, we become even more curious. And it was precisely the way in which I felt that historians of the 19th and earlier 20th century were writing in an apologetic way about the celebration of Purim that I felt it was time to sort of pierce that veil.
So what do you feel is being hidden in the Purim story, which is a story which is about hiddenness anyway?
Well, it's not the Purim story itself, it's what Jews did on Purim. And it's part of a larger issue, namely Jewish violence as a whole. And what I discovered while working on the book, and one of the chapters that's devoted to this, is that it's not only Jews who have a problem with the notion of their own violence, but also a very long anti-Semitic stereotype of a Jew as being inherently cowardly and almost effeminate. And therefore, sometimes even Christians Christian historians would not be willing to accept the evidence of Jewish violence because they felt that Jews were cowardly and incapable of violence. So that it's two kinds of historians. It's Jews who are covering up to make themselves look good, and in some ways Christians who buy into the notion of Jews as being not like other men and less capable of violence, that caused the story to be skewed in both directions. And I felt that it was my obligation to reveal what could be revealed.
So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. So where have you found Jewish violence relating to Purim?
Well, the earliest incident comes from the 5th century. In fact, my book was quite a stretch for me, going from the 5th through the late 20th. Normally I deal with the Middle Ages and Renaissance period. In the town of Inmistar, in 415, two Jews did a kind of mock Passion of Christ and took a Christian child while they were drunk on Purim, tied him to a tree and whipped him, and then he ended up dying accidentally. Now, we know that in the very same time, one of the Roman emperors, Theodosius, who was a Christian emperor, issued a law which appears in official codes of the Roman Empire, warning the Jews to stop burning a cross on Purim, to stop burning Jesus on a cross on Purim, pretending that it's only Haman. So, in fact, we have from the early 5th century in the late Roman Empire, after the empire became Christian, two kinds of evidence of Jews using the holiday of Purim to vent the hostility of Christianity, which they felt but could not express because Christianity had become, early in the 4th century, the official religion of the Roman Empire. And one of the things so of course there have been some historians who tried to cover it up and say, no, it wasn't a Christian child, it was a doll. But
it's just one incident, though.
Right, it's just one incident.
So that doesn't make a whole
As a historian,
series.
exactly. A historian, to me, what's far more significant is a law of the Roman Empire calling upon the Jews or warning them to stop burning the cross. That is to say, undoubtedly, most of the violence on Purim was against symbols of Christianity and not Christians. It's really about the hostility to the Christian religion, to the symbols of the cross as a symbol of Christian power, and even, let's say, if it's a Christian child who was killed inadvertently, it's more about hostility to the Christian religion than to individuals. But of course, Jews in the 19th century were not comfortable with that either. So there tends to be quite a cover-up of this. But on the other hand, a large part of my book also reveals the degree to which anti-Semitic historians of the blood libel use this incident of the early 5th century to, for example, attempt to corroborate the claims that were made in Norwich, England, in the 12th century, actually the 13th, and elsewhere in Europe, that Jews were taking Christian children and killing them before Passover. So that the reason that, you said before, Christians took an interest in Purim, it was after links had been made between Jewish violence on Purim and claims about Jewish ritual murder, and then evidence of Jewish violence even against Christians on Purim were used illegitimately, in my opinion, as an attempt to bolster the claim that Jews had a need for Christian blood.
But the question, though, is, and I know that you cover a vast area, but part of the period that you cover is also the period of the Crusades, where Jews were brutally massacred, killed by Crusaders en route to the Holy Land. I'm sure there have been instances even prior to the Crusades where Jews were made, at the very least, made to feel inferior, second-class citizens. In the worst case, they were slaughtered, killed, massacred in a brutal fashion. We have the keynote that speak about that. So how much of this is a backlash against oppression that Jews face, and it was the only way they can lash back was to take a symbol and on Purim Day to vent against it?
In fact, not only on Purim, one of the chapters in my book, chapter 6, is called The Fascination of the Abomination, and it's about Jews on the cross and Jewish violence against the cross. And there are many instances which I discuss, not having to do with Purim, but having to do with martyrdom. What does a Jew do in the late 11th or 12th century when he's being pressured to convert? In many instances, we have Jews spitting upon the cross or even urinating upon the cross with their very last effort, knowing that they're going to die, knowing that...
But in the context, what you wrote about it, in the context where they're asked to convert and they're going to be killed if they don't, so they're just doing it, that's an act of rebellion.
Right, so what I'm saying is that that the cross and the symbols of Christianity arouse a degree of animosity on the part of the Jews similar to, say, the swastika in later times. And therefore, you have the phenomenon of Jews knowing that they're going to die and deciding what is it they want to do with their last moments. Express it. In fact, quite curiously, this has something to do with the cross, we have evidence of their shouting the Shema Yisrael. Now, why should they shout the Shema? Because they're claiming that God is one and not three. That is to say that it's about transforming their deaths not only into loyalty to God, but expressing hostility to Christianity through their death, which the great Israeli historian Jacob Katz wrote about in his book Exclusiveness and Tolerance. And I'm only extending this his own argument to areas beyond martyrdom like Purim.
But getting back to the thesis regarding Purim itself, over the course of your research, how many instances are we talking about of where the violence on Purim or relating to Purim that Jews have engaged in from, let's say, the 5th century to current times?
Well, I think that one of the most interesting and representative cases is in late 12th century France, in a place called either Bray or Brie. They were not clear from the Hebrew source which it is, but actually we have a Latin account of the same. And there you have a case where a Jew had been killed by a Christian for whatever reason, and the Jews had paid a bribe to the local duchess in order for that Christian to be executed. And then Ephraim Ibon, the Hebrew chronicler, writes, Vayitluhu biyom Purim. And although there are debates about the historians as to exactly how to understand it, it's quite clear that what this means is that the Jews, having paid the bribe for the Christian murderer to be executed, chose the day of Purim and the means of death. That is to say, hanging, similar to both Haman and Jesus, and on the day of Purim. In fact, we have a Latin parallel account of the same event, where not only was the Christian executed, but before he was executed, there was a kind of parody of the Passion of Christ, in which a cross of thorns, a crown of thorns was put on his head, and they more or less repeated the experience of Jesus himself. So it was clear that aside from punishing this one murderer, an attempt was made to use the holiday of Purim, and perhaps to do it under the guise of festivity and drunkenness, as a means of unleashing a very deep animosity towards the Christian religion.
Which at that time, I have to, again, for historical context, Jews were persecuted at various times.
Right. Well, the job of the historian is not to say whether they were justified in the violence or not.
No, I'm just saying putting in historical context.
Only to say that this is how things work. There are reactions. When people are pressed hard, sometimes they can strike right back. Sometimes they have to come around and respond in indirect manners. In fact, here I would refer to what some sociologists have called weapons of the weak. Jews, when they were weak, did not have conventional weapons. They had weapons of the weak, and sometimes weapons of the weak can be quite brutal. But it's because they don't have the conventional way of responding. In this case, the Jews, as I said, were less hostile to individual Christians than they were to Christianity as a religion and as a power of oppression. And although all year they had to pretty much stay in line, Purim was the opportunity they had. They allowed themselves for letting loose. And, as I said, no accident that Haman was hung, that Jesus was hung. That is to say, the Hebrew word tliyah and Hebrew words tliyah and sliva are synonymous. So from the Jewish point of view, the hanging of Haman and the crucifixion of Jesus are the same words. And the two characters were in many ways also in piyutim for Purim. The two characters were conflated.
We're speaking with Professor Elliott Horowitz, who is Associate Professor of Jewish History at Bar Ilan University in Israel. His fascinating book is called Reckless Rights, Purim and the Legacy of Jewish Violence. This broadcast is from our archives. Professor Elliott Horowitz has unfortunately passed away, but we present it again because of his interesting thesis that he's presented. We're going to be right back.
Talkline radio and TV with Zev Brenner is just phenomenal. Everybody concerned about the Jewish community should listen and watch. He has the best guests. He asks the most interesting questions. He's always so well prepared. It's talk radio and television from a Jewish point of view at its very best.
To advertise on the Talkline network and Talkline's email and social media blasts reaching over 70,000 people, please call 212-769-1925, extension 100. That's 212-769-1925, extension 100. Or email info@talklinenetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community. You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Our interview tonight, Professor Elliott Horowitz of blessed memory, is from our archives, and Professor Horowitz has theorized that Jews became more violent throughout history on Purim. We continue our interview. Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Live in our studios is Professor Elliott Horowitz, Associate Professor of Jewish History, Bar-Ilan University. His fascinating book is called Reckless Rights, Purim and the Legacy of Jewish Violence. Professor, you're talking about how Purim, which is considered a relatively minor holiday in the Jewish scheme of things, yet the Christians and Jews have been fascinated by it. In fact, you write that Hitler himself was concerned that if he failed in his mission, that Jews would have another holiday similar to Purim.
Well, as you said, the Germans, both during and before the Holocaust, were aware of the nature of the holiday of Purim, partially because even going back to Martin Luther is quoted as saying that of all the books in the Bible, the one that he would have removed from the Hebrew Bible was the book of Esther, which he considered to be too Jewish. And by too Jewish, he meant too revengeful because of the end of the book. So it's a very interesting way in which, from Luther to Hitler and to Streicher, whom we mentioned before, Germans and other Christians in Europe were aware of the degree to which Purim was a potentially revolutionary holiday because it's, as we know, v'nafochu, it's a holiday of reversal. And in the ghettos of Europe, as historians of the Holocaust have shown, the Nazis would prevent the Jews from reading the Megillah, from observing Purim, and in some cases engage in rather cruel jokes like hanging 10 Jews on the day of Purim as revenge for the 10 sons of Haman. And therefore, it's not at all surprising that from the 1930s on, Hitler was referred to by Jews as a sort of code name of Haman. In other words, they would write and say, and there is a new Haman emerging in Germany, and of course the H&H played a role in a certain way. And one of the chapter that deals with the image of Haman in Jewish culture also discusses how Hitler came to be seen as a new Haman.
In fact, the story is told that in the Megillah it says that Esther asked permission to hang the 10 sons of Haman, which already were hung. So it says the word Yitla, which means they will be hung in the future. So the way the story is told of these 10 sons of Haman are the 10 Nazis that were about to be executed after the war. Actually, there were 11, but one committed suicide. 10 were hung, among them Julius Streicher. I believe it was he who shouted at Purim.
We're in 1946.
46
right.
When he was hung.
Right.
Famous story.
Yeah. Well, the issue of the 10 sons of Haman is actually quite interesting. In the Middle Ages, as we know, Jews were, until the 20th century, never particularly interested in visual art, but yet we have illustrated manuscripts here and there. And in illustrated machzorim of the Middle Ages, the one most consistently popular image for accompanying, let's say, piyutim for Purim or Shabbat Zachor is the image of the 10 sons of Haman hanging. For Jews, that was really central, and partially because they saw them as Amalekites. And in fact, probably the only explanation from a Jewish point of view for why Haman's own sons had to be killed was, if you see Haman Ha'agagi, Haman as the Agagite, and therefore a member of the tribe of the Amalekites, all of whom, according to the Torah, have to be destroyed. And as I mentioned to you before, one of the chapters of my book deals with the understanding of Amalek through the generations, from the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud until the 20th century. And there too we come back to Christianity, because the term used already in the Talmud for Rome, the kind of code word was Esav or Edom. And as we know from the book of Genesis, Amalek was the grandson of Esav. And therefore, there was the sense throughout the Middle Ages that if Amalek was still in the world, which they felt he was, that somewhere in European Christendom was the place in which the Amalekites were residing.
Well,
so this together with, if we see on the one hand the image of Haman and Jesus, both finding their death through hanging, and the sense of Amalek being the grandson of Esav connected with Edom and Christianity. So the history of Purim in Christian Europe is very different from that in the Islamic world, where it's much less of a history of violence against neighbors or Muslims or whatever until, of course, the 20th century.
But when you say violence, though, is the violence, except for that incident where you mentioned where there was a child that was killed and you said it was an accident, they did something they shouldn't have done, but there are a lot of incidents of actual violence of Jew against non-Jew around the Purim time, or is it mainly where they desecrated Christian symbols in certain limited amounts in areas? I mean, what are we talking about?
Most of the violence is against Christian images, and even when it's against individuals, it has to do with them as a symbol. For example, the Christian child who died in the 5th century was really seen as a way to reenact the Passion of the Christ. Or, say, in the late 12th century France, what I mentioned before, when there was a murderer whom the Jews paid a bribe to have killed, they chose the day of Purim, but not only did they put him to death, but they used his death as an opportunity to mock the Passion of Christ.
But does that constitute violence? The way it's being portrayed, that there's a whole legacy of Jewish violence. Purim, is there a legacy, or are there isolated incidents?
Well, there certainly is a legacy of violence connected with Purim if we think about today's Torah reading, which is to destroy and decimate the Amalekites. In fact, King Saul was punished for leaving one Amalekite alive, King Agag,
which Haman descended from.
So there's no doubt that this is what has to be called genocide in modern language, and how Judaism can allow this is a subject not for historians but for theologians to work.
But except, though, in fairness, though, you don't find we have lists in the Shulchan Aruch, we have codification. There's no commandment today where we have even obscure mitzvot, commandments of being done, Shaluach HaKhan, sending the mother bird away. We don't find anyone coming out and saying, you must go out and kill somebody from Amalek. We don't find people looking for that. We don't do it, even though it's written in the books.
Right, because
we don't do that.
We're at the opposite end of the Shulchan Aruch, as I mentioned to you before we went on air. Through the Middle Ages, Jewish rabbis and poskim and scholars dealt with the question of the applicability in their day of the commandment to destroy Amalek and what should be done about it. For example, not in the Islamic world, where the rabbis were not worried about it because it had little implication for their lives, but in Christian Europe, rabbis came up with the notion that the war with Amalek applied only when there was a Jewish king. And in fact, as a result, the Tur, which was written in Spain but by an Ashkenazi rabbi, deleted the mitzvah. If you look through the Tur, there's a mitzvah to remember Amalek. There is not a mitzvah to destroy Amalek. And also in the Shulchan Aruch, there's no such mitzvah any longer. But until the 14th century, Jews were living with the real question of what do I do if I think somebody is an Amalekite? And the famous Sefer Chinuch, written in 13th century Spain, said black on white that if, even in our day for him, 13th century, if you see an Amalekite, you must kill him. So that when I speak about a legacy of violence, it's more connected with the commandments connected with Amalek than it is with the actual celebration of Purim. But of course, the two went hand in hand because of the centrality of Amalek and Zachor to the celebration of Purim.
Because you don't find really cases of Jews going out even after the World War II, and we believe that Hitler was Amalek, and you don't find them going out and enacting that violence. Most Jews, again, you pointed to the Torah, but even the Rambam says when it comes to Amalek, if you can engage in a peace treaty with them, you should first engage in a peace treaty. Those believe that Amalek will be eradicated when Mashiach comes, when the end of days.
Yes, but that's not the Rambam. The Rambam.
No, I didn't say Rambam, but the Rambam says that if you have an Amalek, a nation, if you know who they are, you should first try to engage in peace with them, not just go first and destroy them. So you find there is a watering down, so to speak, of the commandment in Torah is very clear, but you find it's not practical.
But what's very striking is when the Rambam speaks about the 7 nations of Canaan, he says that we no longer know who they are, avad zichram. And then he goes on to say, however, there is a commandment to destroy Amalek, and it's very clear that for the Rambam in the 12th century, there were still Amalekites in the world, and it could not be said that they were no longer present.
We don't know because Sancherib, mixed up the nations,
not
so
about,
we don't know who they are. But even with that,
the
Rambam says
that Amalekites are still in the world.
Right, but he says that if you have an opportunity to engage into a peace pact with them, you first go with that because they're not really, and I think it's brought down by the Kesef Mishnah that they're not really a Molech if they're willing to engage in peace with the Jewish people.
Right. We should mention the Kesef Mishnah is also the author of the Shulchan Aruch who omitted the commandment. On the other hand, in Ashkenazic Europe, it was felt as a very live tradition, said because Amalek, like Edom, came to be used as a term for Christians. In fact, in my chapter on Amalek, I show how it was used as a code word over the centuries for Christians who were particularly disliked. He is an Amalek, he's an Amalekite. And in fact,
but the verb was done to act on that, though.
They would act on it on Purim, not through the year. That is, say, someone who was seen as a Amalekite was someone whom the Jews would fear all year, but on Purim, combination of perhaps being stirred on by the story of Israel's victory against Amalek, and perhaps by the commandment to drink beyond a reasonable amount, there was more violence than other days. And more violence than many historians have been willing to recognize, which is the point of the book.
We're speaking with Professor Elliott Horowitz. His book is called Reckless Rights, Purim and the Legacy of Jewish Violence.
This broadcast is from our archives. Professor Elliott Horowitz, of blessed memory, unfortunately passed away, but it is interesting scholarship that he's written, and we present it for you, especially as we look at the observance of Purim in Jewish history. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Talkline radio and TV with Zev Brenner is just phenomenal. Everybody concerned about the Jewish community should listen and watch. He has the best guests. He asks the most interesting questions. He's always so well prepared. It's talk radio and television from a Jewish point of view at its very best.
To advertise on the Talkline network and Talkline's email and social media blasts reaching over 70,000 people, please call 212-769-1925, extension 100. That's 212-769-1925.